Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London with another watch video, and today we're taking a look at the Rolex Submariner reference 14060. As with all my reviews, let's go back in time now and take a look at the history of this Rolex Submariner. We're just going to look at the very basic history of this model. If you want to learn the real in-depth history of the Submariner, how it was introduced to the Rolex collection, then go check out my 114060 review, which is much more in-depth. This one will just look at the very basic history anyway. So we're going to go back in time to 1953, which is when Rolex first released the Submariner. It was a professional dive watch aimed at professional divers. It featured a very high water resistance, which meant it could dive to very deep depths. It featured a rotating bezel that showed, or was able to show, elapsed time, so a diver could monitor how much time they'd been underwater for and therefore calculate how much oxygen remained in their tanks. Featured various other options as well on the watch that helped divers, complete their dive. It was actually a very popular model, not just with divers though, but later on became, specifically in the 60s, really popular with just the general public because the watch was built so ruggedly to withstand that level of depth and water resistance. It had quite a solid case. So people tended to buy it to wear every single day because they knew it could withstand the knocks of daily life. And now those people are called desk divers because that's where they're diving, is on the desk. So throughout the history, or after that, kind of after the 60s, most of the people that bought this watch weren't actually divers. Later in 1962, so a couple of years after Rolex released the Submariner, Rolex released the reference 5513, which has become a bit of a legend and iconic model. It's one of the kind of collector's favorites in terms of the Submariner. It's a really, really beautiful model. I absolutely love it. There were other models released later on after the 5513, but we're actually specifically looking at the no date, which is kind of the most pure versions of the Submariner. So models or iterations of the Submariner without the date window, like the first reference, the 5513, and this one that we're looking at today. So the 5513 was actually in production from 1962 until 1990, so it had an incredibly long product cycle, which is pretty amazing. And the model that replaced the 5513 in 1990 was in fact the 14060, which is what we're looking at today. This specific model or example that we're looking at is from 1997, just to give you an idea of where that is in its timeline. And the 14060 was a really important model in the fact that it was kind of a real reinvention of the Submariner versus the 5513. Yes, it carried over the same kind of look, but it was a totally new design in many ways. It was actually the first Submariner to feature a sapphire crystal glass, which meant it could increase its dive depth down to 300 meters as opposed to 200 meters. It also featured the new triplock crown, which meant, again, that it could go to 300 meters. It basically was a much more watertight, water-resistant crown system versus the older models. It featured various other different updates and changes versus the 5513. Later on in 1999, the 14060 was replaced by the 14060M, which basically just featured an updated movement, and that was about it. A few years later on, obviously, we got the 14060, which is just the modern supercase version of this watch. So that concludes the basic history. Let's take a look now at the features of this watch. We're going to start, as always, with the clasp. The clasp on this watch is the kind of standard checkerboard style clasp. It's not my favorite clasp. I much prefer the modern day clasps that Rolexes have. Definitely the glide lock clasp on the modern day Submariners is absolutely fantastic. So yeah, this one is okay. The reason why I don't love this one as much as the modern day ones is because this just feels very tinny, very hollow, kind of a bit fragile, and definitely not as hard wearing and beautifully machined as the modern day variants. But it's okay, it's fine, it's very comfortable. It does feature kind of like an Easy Link style adjustment. This one has a much greater adjustment than Easy Link though. The reason they did this is so that when they originally released the Submariner, they wanted to make a way for divers to be able to wear the same watch over the top of a wetsuit and then on their bare wrist, rather than having to take out links and add links. They wanted a really easy way for the owner to be able to transition from bare wrist to wetsuit. So this has got a big amount of adjustment here in the bracelet. Moving now onto the bracelet. The bracelet is a very kind of standard oyster bracelet on this watch. There are some differences between this though and the modern day variants. This one definitely feels much more hollow and kind of tinny than the modern day variants. The modern day oyster bracelets feel very, very solid and really beautifully machined. And the bracelet is in an all brush finish, which looks really nice. I love that about the Submariners, that they are kind of a bit more understated in that respect. Moving now on to our case. We've got a 40mm case size, but it wears much smaller than the modern day 40mm Submariners, which have the super case, which is much more chunky, much deeper, kind of bulkier. The lugs feel like they've got a bit more presence. This is extremely elegant by comparison. I love this case. I actually much prefer this case to the modern day Submariners. It's got, again, polished finish on the sides and then brush finish on top. We've got these really beautiful, elegant, fine, thin lugs on this watch, which is just so much nicer in my opinion than the modern day one. I like both, but I much prefer this. We've got the pinhole lugs as well, where you basically release the lug pins to take off the bracelet, which is again kind of iconic older style Rolex. I really, really like the lug holes on these. Next, moving on to our bezel, we've got a rotating bezel, again unidirectional like the modern day watches, and this one features the aluminium bezel, which is different to the ceramic on the modern day watches. The aluminium's okay. The advantage of aluminium, in my opinion, and something that I love about the aluminium, is that it can fade with time, and it kind of is more prone to getting love marks rather than the ceramic just stays perfect forever. You may get some scratches on it if you find something very hard like a diamond or something, but it tends to look pretty fresh for a long time, no fading whatsoever. Whereas these just kind of build character over time, which I much prefer. This watch overall has much more character than. And moving now onto our dial, we've got a really, really beautiful, very simple, elegant dial. Obviously this one is the no date variant, so it's much cleaner than the date version. I love the symmetry of the no date Submariners. This one is, you know, beautiful in that way. Also, it is much more simple, this dial, than the modern day ones, because it features a little bit less text on the dial. It doesn't feature the certified text that we have down at 6 o'clock like we do on the modern watches. The dial also does not feature the maxi style markers that we see on the modern day watches, so the markers are a little bit smaller on this watch versus the modern ones, which I much prefer. It just gives it a bit more of an elegant, kind of classy, a bit more understated and subtle look versus the modern watches. Yeah, really, really beautiful, super elegant watch. Who do I think this watch is for? I think if you're a Submariner fan, that you kind of prefer the older style Submariners, the slightly smaller case sizes, then this is a fantastic watch for you, because it features the no date, so it's a bit more pure to the original, and it's just a really elegant piece. I'd say it's a bit more under the radar versus the modern day Submariners, because of its slightly smaller case, you know, footprint. Yeah, I'd say for the people that really like the essence of Rolex and kind of the older style Rolex, this is a fantastic model. We also have many clients that own modern Rolexes and this model also. I think you can really appreciate both of them, and they both wear quite differently. So I don't think it's, you know, a really bad thing to own both the modern and this vintage version. Would I own this watch? Definitely. I much prefer this to the modern ones. I just think it wears much nicer on my wrist, purely because it's just smaller and more elegant, in my opinion. I'd say that's kind of true about a lot of the vintage Rolexes versus the modern day. Because they kind of have a bit more of a smaller footprint, they tend to look a bit more classic, which I really, really like. Thanks guys for watching. Let us know in the comments if you would own this watch. And as always, if you're interested in this piece, which is actually available from us now, then don't hesitate to contact us. Our details are in the description. And at the end of the video, it'll be a pleasure to assist you with this watch.